Dear students, welcome to e-learning Samveda class. In today's class, we are going to discuss a chapter from history, that is chapter number 4, Ancient Civilizations of the World. In these ancient civilizations of the world, you are going to learn about Egyptian civilization, Mesopotamian civilization, and Chinese civilization. These Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Chinese civilization, which is flourished, which was developed in Asia and Africa. Let us begin with the Egyptian civilization. If we come to the Egyptian civilization which was developed on the river bank of Nile. The Egyptian civilization could take birth due to the presence of the river Nile. The relics, the evidence says, proclaims the greatness of Egyptians, the grandeur of Egypt. The Egyptian culture and the history we were trying to know from the huge pyramids which were built in Egypt, the sculptures which was found in Egypt, the temples and the inscriptions which were founded in Egypt. And these pyramids, sculptures, temples and inscriptions speaks about the Egyptian culture and the history. Dear students, let us go and discuss about the contributions of Egyptians. Of course, since the river Nile is flowing, the people who were settled down on the river bank of Nile, they were started to do agriculture. So, we call them as farmers. They were aware about irrigation, and even to worship the god, they were built temples. And during the time of Egyptians, they were invented the calendar which was helped them to calculate or the measure the time. These Egyptians, they were used symbolic language of writings. The symbolic drawing, which one they were drawn by the Egyptians, we called as hieroglyphics. What do you mean by hieroglyphics? Hieroglyphic is nothing but the Egyptians were followed symbolic language, which was consist of small drawings. That drawings will be a symbol. The symbolic language or the symbolic drawing which was followed by the Egyptians were called as hieroglyphics. These hieroglyphics they called as sacred writings. Let us come. This Nile Valley or Egyptian Valley civilization, which was took place on the river bank of Nile, there was a huge lake. On the lake on the river valley only, the civilization was took place. And there were the priests. These priests will interpret about the nature and they will explain about the nature. And they believed the priests were protecting the writing documents. Whatever the documents have written, those documents and those hieroglyphics, who's supposed to protect? The priest supposed to protect. They believed that once these priest dies, after death of the priest, they will get relife. That is why they believed in life after the death. And they believed that the man had to give account for his deeds, whatever he has done on this earth. Deed is nothing but whatever things you have done on this earth, after the death, you have to give account to the God. That is why the death god, the god of life, the god they called as Osiris. Whom they called as Osiris? The god of life or the death god they called as Osiris. These priests were considered that life on the earth was temporary. So we are living on this earth is not a permanent. But when after the death, we are going to get a long life. That will be a permanent life. That is why the whole of Nile Valley was reserved for the dead. During this Egyptian civilization, these priests or the kings who dies, their dead body would be smeared with a chemical and wrapped with a cloth. Look at the picture. They are smeared with chemicals and wrapped with cloth. It would be kept specially designed coffin. In the beginning, these coffin boxes were curved by the rock. And later on, they made in different designs. That is why I told you, it would be kept specially designed coffin and kept items needed for daily use and small dolls of a cook and a barber. In the beginning, I told you, the graves were created by the curving into rocks, but later on, they built tall towers. The tall towers which was built for these coffin or these dead body, that is called as pyramids. To build these tall towers, the tall buildings, they used huge block stones. Dear students, the rulers of Egypt, the kings of Egypt, the emperors of Egypt, they were called as Paroha. Who were called as Paroha? The kings or the wealthy people who lived in the tall towers, the tall buildings, they were called them as Paroha. The Greeks called these structures as pyramids. The kings of Egypt were called as Parohas. Paroha means a person who lives in palatial house, that huge house, tall house, the tall towers, and they were called as Paroha. And there were peasants who accepted the rule of powerful Osiris. Osiris is nothing but I told you, these are the powerful people going to call Paroha, the king or the emperor. The rulers of Egypt, who were ruled Egypt? The Egypt was ruled by a tribal community people. In the beginning, the Arabian shepherd tribal community people who ruled Egypt, and they were called as Hyksos. Later the Hyksos, the Jewish people who came in search of shelter, who came to Egypt. But the people who were in Egypt, they hated the Jewish people and they chased them out. The another tribal community people, we call them as Thebes, they rose in revolt against the foreigners, and they were very much successful to driving out Hyksos from their country. After that, the another tribal community people who came under the rule of Sardanapalus in Assyria. The Persian emperors, Cambyses, they occupied Egypt in 6th BCE, before the Common Era. After that, Alexander, a Macedonian ruler, who occupied Persia in 4th BC. Now, this Egypt fell in the hands of Macedonian ruler. Who is the Macedonian ruler? The Greek ruler we call Alexander. Now, Egypt fell in the hands of whom? Macedonia. Dear students, after the Macedonian ruler, after the Alexander, the Egypt became a province of Alexander's military general. Now, the military general of Alexander or Macedonia who declared himself as the king of Egypt, and he was established a dynasty called Ptolemy. And he was made a city called Alexandria. Who made a city Alexandria? Ptolemy was made a city Alexandria. Later on, this Egypt fell in the hands of Romans. That was in 13 BCE. The last queen of Egypt, we call her Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the last Egyptian queen. Romans were feared more than the war about her beauty. Romans feared her beauty more than her troops. However, in 30 BCE, the Caesar's successor, the son-in-law of Caesar, we call him as Augustus Caesar, he only defeated Cleopatra. After he was defeated Cleopatra, he took her to the prison. When he took her on the way to the prison, who going to call her Cleopatra, she consumed the poison and she was ended her life. She committed suicide. From then onwards, Egypt was part and parcel of Roman Empire. Who started to rule the Egypt now? Rome. So far we have discussed about Egyptian civilization. Now the another civilization we are going to discuss, we are going to call Mesopotamian civilization. The Mesopotamia lies between the two rivers. What are the two rivers? One we are going to call Euphrates and Tigris, that is in West Asia. So it is called as land between two rivers. The Greeks were called as Mesopotamia. In the northern Elite tribes and southern nomadic tribes, they were trying to establish over this area. They tried to occupy this area. As a result, the rivalry, the battle which took place between these tribes, which was continued for a long period. That is why we are saying now, endless conflicts. These Mesopotamians, in Mesopotamia, there is a first tribal people who settled there called Sumerians. The Sumerians who were the first who evolved the system of writings. Followed by the Sumerians, Babylonians came, Assyrians came, and Persians also came. But the Sumerians, which one they evolved the system of writings, they called as cuneiform. In olden days, Euphrates and Tigris rivers are referred as Babylonia. Which one is called Babylonia? In olden days, in olden times, the land between Euphrates and Tigris, they called as Babylonia. The northern part of Babylonia was called as Akkad, and the southern part of Babylonia they called as Sumer. The northern part of Mesopotamia was known as Assyria. Which one is called as Assyria? The northern part of Mesopotamia they called as Assyria. Now we are going to discuss another structure we call ziggurat. Who do we call these Mesopotamians? They were lived in the hill stations and they were a tribal people and they continued the war for a long time. That is why I told you, endless hatredness and conflicts were continued for a long time. The Sumerians, who were the first, they give up the place, the tribal area or the hill stations, they came down. And they were used to worship the gods. That is why, to worship the gods, they built it on the top, on the hills. The building, the artificial building on the hills they built it, what they built it, they called as ziggurat. They did not know much about staircase. How to build the steps they don't know. That is why around the ziggurat they made sloping galleries. The Jewish people, They call the ziggurat as Towers of Babel. Who called as Towers of Babel? Jewish people call as Towers of Babel. The another important ruler we're going to discuss here, Hammurabi. Before we're going to discuss about Hammurabi, let me introduce to you how this Hammurabi, how these Amorites start to rule. Before these Amorites, the rulers who were ruled in Mesopotamia means, I told you, Sumerians. The Sumerians who were tribal people who settled down in Mesopotamia on the rivers of Euphrates and Tigris, followed by Sumerians, the another tribal people who came from Arabian desert, they called as Akkadians. After the Akkadians, the another tribal group of people who came to Mesopotamia is none other than Amorites. The most famous, the eminent king who ruled Amorites was Hammurabi. Who do we call this Hammurabi? He built a famous palace which was at Babylonia. And Hammurabi was very famous for his code of justice, code of law, or we can call code of justice. What a code of justice says, he had a principle, eye for a eye, tit for tit. If anybody harms you, the same kind of punishment should be given to them as a reward, as a punishment. That is called code of justice, the code of law. After that, Hittites who came to defeat, and they defeated by the Assyrians. These Assyrians were followed by Asura. They were the desert god people. The Assyrians were occupied the West Asia. Later on, Chaldeans. These Chaldeans were re-established in Babylonia in 7th century. After that, after re-establishing the Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, he became the ruler. He was the greatest king during the time of Chaldeans. After that, later the Chaldeans, who was the greatest ruler? Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylonia. He was encouraged the study of science. But the Chaldeans came under the attack of Persians that was in the 6th century of BC. This Nebuchadnezzar only created hanging garden. It is believed he got married a princess. To make her happy, he was built a beautiful hanging garden. 200 years later, Alexander transferred his place to the Semitic people into Greek province. Of course, so many years these Mesopotamia was ruled. Later on, Alexander was invaded on the Mesopotamia and he captured. And the Semitic people, the Semitic region, the Arab region, he was made as a Greek province. After the rule of the Romans, the Turks were followed Alexander. In such a way, the Mesopotamian civilization also started to decline. So far, we discussed about Egyptian civilization. Even we have discussed about Mesopotamian civilization. Now, the another civilization we are going to discuss, that is the Chinese civilization. The Chinese civilization also known as China's sorrow. Why it is called as China's sorrow? There is a river in China we call Wanggu River. When there is a heavy rainfall, this Wanggu River flow full of water. Sometimes it overflows. Overflowing the river we called as flood. Due to the flood, this river change the course. The river which moves, sometimes it change the directions. If the change the directions, it will be destroys houses, many agricultural lands. That is why there will be loss of life, property, So it is called as sorrow of China or China's sorrow. That is why the Huanghe River they called as symbol of sorrow. How do you know about this? How do you know about this Chinese civilization? According to archaeological evidence, the China was ruled by Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty was ruled from 18th century to 12th century BC. The Shang Dynasty was overpowered. After the Shang Dynasty, the another dynasty who came to power means they call Chow Dynasty. The Chow Dynasty continued the good traditions of Shang culture. Whatever the Shang was introduced, the culture was followed by the even Chow Dynasty. And they ruled till 250 BCE. If we come about the Chow Dynasty, who are we going to call the king? He gave a portions of land to his officials. In return, the officials have to come and help the king during the time of battle. If the war takes place, who are going to call these officials? They have to come and support the king by sending the soldiers. Apart from them, there were merchants and there were the peasants and even the slaves were in the kingdom. The soldiers were enjoyed the dignity of life in the society. The soldiers were respected in the society. At the same time, the soldiers were used as ornaments. The soldiers were used as weapons. They were used bronze helmets, metal armors, and the soldiers were even they used the bronze daggers, axe, bow, and even they used iron-tipped arrows. Dear students, if you go and study about the economic condition of the China, in those days, during the time of Shang Dynasty, they were dependent upon agriculture. Agriculture was the main occupation. These Chinese had well-organized system of irrigation. They were aware about the irrigation. They used to grow plenty of rice. The Chinese were used to wear the thin cotton dresses. And they were the first who discovered the silk in this world. The silk manufacturing was prominent industry in China. The Chinese were used to make excellent pots, and even they learned to make various objects from porcelain. Dear students, so far we have discussed about Egyptian civilization. As we have discussed in Egypt, I told you there was a death god, or after the death, they believed the priests or the kings will get a real life. That is why they believed in Osiris. These Egyptians also, they were learned to writing. The symbolic writings we called as hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are called as symbolic writings of Egyptians. The kings who were ruled Egypt, they were called as Paroha. Who was the last queen of Egypt? Cleopatra was the last queen of Egypt. Then who was the most famous king of Amorite? The most famous king of Amorite was Hammurabi. How the mummy was preserved? As I told you, the dead bodies, actually if you come to the dead body, they'll remove the inner organs and they make their cloth and chemicals. Chemicals will be smeared on the body, and there will be thin white cloth will be so tightly will be smeared or will be packed. In such a way, they'll pack the body and kept in coffin. They kept in the coffin box and they're preserved. In the beginning, I told you, they curved the rock and they made a box. But later on, they made different shapes of the buildings or tall buildings. the tall building which was built by these Egyptians, I told you, that is pyramids. The rulers of pyramids were called as Paroha. Now, which river you called as Sorrow of China? Wango River. Dear students, for the next class, when you come for the next class, you learn and come about Egyptian civilization, even the Mesopotamian civilization, and even the Chinese civilization. The Mesopotamian civilization took place. Between which rivers the Mesopotamian civilization took place? Between Euphrates and Tigris. The writings of Mesopotamians we called as cuneiform. Same way, if you come to China, as I told you, in China, they were dependent upon agriculture. Not only dependent upon agriculture, even they had a thin cotton cloth and they used to produce the silk. Dear students, so far we have discussed about Egypt and Mesopotamia and even Chinese civilization. I am Mr. Jero. I am working as an assistant master in St. Joseph's High School, Brian Square, that is in Bangalore. Thank you. We'll meet you in another class. Have a nice day.